Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see the auditorium full again and people on Zoom after our 1-week break. I'm Ann Kinseth. I'm Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum, and we're thrilled to have you for the third in our 4-part series, Feasting and Fasting in Early Modern Spain. So with that, I will invite Dr. Jodi Campbell back to the podium.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? We were playing with microphones earlier. This is all right. Thank you. I'm so glad to be back here. I'm glad to have all of you back here as well. This has been tremendous fun to be able to do this series, and a real honor to be able to speak at the Meadows. So I'm glad that you're allowing me to be part of this. And in chatting with folks after the first couple of talks, I've fielded some questions about recipe collections. If you'd like to play with some of these things, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about early modern recipes and food, and then Spanish in particular, a couple of resources I would recommend. Ken Albala, I think by far is the best food historian. He's enormously prolific. He's at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. And he's published all sorts of really accessible, engaging, interesting things on food history and Renaissance banquets and that sort of thing in the early modern period. So lots of books, and I've mentioned 3, he's probably got 20 more. He has a blog where he recounts lots of experiments with early modern cooking. So he's a great resource. Rachel Loudon has a great website. She's also a key food historian. And her website includes some kind of background on how to do food history and what it is, along with recipes, and also a blog of her experiences. And if you want to get a little bit more involved, there's the Early Modern Recipes Online Collective that mostly works with English sources, but early modern recipes and their projects of transcribing and digitizing. And they have some public transcription projects. So if you have a good eye for handwriting, if you can decipher 16th century scribbles, they welcome volunteer help for things like this. And they also have interesting discussions of recipes and ingredients. So all of those things are interesting sort of gateways into playing with food history. What I've been hoping to give you is this kind of a combination of what food history has to offer, and using that as a window into the context of early modern Spain, the world of Murillo and Velázquez, and the many of the painters that are featured here at the Meadows, and then the kinds of insights that food history can give us into that world, into those relationships and those communities. And one thing I like about being a Spanish historian overall, not just for the early modern period, but Spain, in many ways it has a different history from the rest of Europe. But if you're looking for historical lessons, I think Spain has lots of things to offer. The rise and fall of an empire, civil war in the 20th century that gives us really the sort of preview to World War II, the first clashes between communism and fascism, a dictatorship in the 20th century, and a successful transition to democracy. So all of these interesting models, if you're looking for historical lessons about things. But more relevant to our period, in the medieval period, Spain has this richly multicultural, multi-confessional society that is very successful for several centuries, and then gives way to one that's much more rigid and much more uniform. So that's an interesting historical lesson as well. So I'm guessing many of you have been to Spain, right? It's easy to see really especially in the South, but the remnants of medieval Spain has this very rich mixing of Jewish and Muslim and Christian cultures. So you see this in the architecture of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, or the gardens of the Alhambra in Granada, or maybe the synagogues in Toledo of El Tránsito, or Santa María la Blanca. So these are monuments to these places that were shared by, that reflect the contributions of Muslims and Jews, mostly in the 9th and 10th centuries. You would not see, especially in these religious spaces, you would not see Muslims and Jews occupying them now, at least not for religious purposes. They've been converted into churches, or in some cases into museums. But they represent this period when Christians and Jews and Muslims lived together, learned from each other, were neighbors, and cooperated in this interaction that we call convivencia. A great Spanish term that means with living together, right? Convivencia, this living together. Historians love this as an example because it shows that it's possible. In the modern world, we might doubt this more and more, but humans are capable of this kind of cooperation. And these are societies where religion matters very much as a person's identity. People care if they're Christians or Jews or Muslims, but they don't see that difference as a source of conflict. In fact, there are rich discussions and interactions that turn this period, again, especially the 9th and 10th, 11th centuries, into a cultural golden age that is far more advanced in terms of culture, science, philosophy, medicine than really anywhere else in Europe. And it also this really paves the way for the Renaissance. So on the one hand, there's this model of success, especially theological discussions. There are theologians from all three religions that meet and discuss and argue, but in very constructive and productive kinds of ways. But of course, that begins to come to an end with this sort of process of political unification of the Spanish Peninsula, especially under the leadership of Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of Castile and Aragon. So Spain has been formed over the medieval period as this collection of smaller kingdoms that are gradually pulled together through marriage and diplomacy, eventually to the larger kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and then with the famous marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, then eventually towards a modern political state of Spain. But that means greater emphasis on political unification, which goes along with religious unification. The nicknames of Ferdinand and Isabella are the most Catholic kings. It's fundamental to their identity. They are closely supported by the Pope. So that means increasing pressure on this formerly mixed, culturally rich community to identify more and more with the Catholic Church. And this is something that happens broadly across Europe, but I think you see it most strikingly in Spain. For example, Spain gets the association with the expulsion of its Jewish population in 1492. That happens, it's not exaggerated, but there's a significant Jewish population to expel, in part because they had already been kicked out of England and France. So there is sort of a growing anti-Semitism in Europe. It's not unique to Spain in any way. What is a little bit more uniquely Spanish is the presence, along with this, about 5% of the population is Jewish. There's also the presence of a significant Muslim population, unlike most of the rest of Europe. With the expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, Muslim troops occupy most of the Spanish peninsula, and then there's the slow process of the Christian reconquest following that. But this means there's a substantial Muslim presence for several centuries. And in fact, Spanish, you see this heritage again in the Mosque of Cordoba. You see it in architecture, in food, in language. Spanish borrows a great deal from Arabic, especially words related to food and agriculture. But again, by the early 1500s, these kingdoms, these smaller kingdoms that form as part of the Reconquista, are being consolidated into a single state that is closely allied with the church, and that becomes more and more closely identified with religious loyalty. If you're not Catholic, it's not a question of individual salvation as much as someone who is not Catholic is potentially a danger to the community and to the state. So in various stages, really from 1492 through the 1500s, from 1492 to 1609, the Muslim and Jewish populations are gradually forced to either convert, to become Catholic, or to leave. And then both of these happen. Many leave, many more stay and accept baptism, accept conversion. And it's interesting that they are then known, the Jewish populations who convert to Christianity are known as conversos, and the Muslim population that converts are known as moriscos, which I point out simply because they're not known as Christians. Like that's the logic. They are converted, they should be all Christians, but they receive these different labels, which means there's always that perception of them as recent converts, as therefore a potentially suspect population. So many of these perhaps are genuine conversions. It's hard to know. Many are not. And since it is hard to know, we have seen, as I've mentioned the last couple of presentations, with food, and those of you who are staying for Rebecca Tracy's gallery talk today with clothing, or if you've seen Amanda Wonder's online talk a few weeks ago on clothing in the court of Philip IV, presentation is really a key part of identity. And you should be able to look at someone and see who they are. So the question with this process of establishing Catholicism is not so much what you believe as a Christian, as do you look like a Christian? Can you be recognized visibly as a Christian? And that introduces a kind of an interesting gender element as well, in that there's sort of a performance of Christian identity. And in many of these convert families, the men would have a more public role, going to mass, going to confession, participating in festivals, joining processions, visible things that would mark you as Christian, while women at home would be more likely to teach their children prayers and prepare food and maintain rituals in a certain way. So if one were to maintain a different religious identity, that could happen secretly at home under women's guidance, while the public performance of Christian uniformity would happen externally. So there's an interesting distinction between sort of public religious identity and private religious identity. But if you look at this from the perspective of the state or the church, you have an interest in policing proper religious practice. How would you know if the things that are visible are being done correctly? You can't look at someone and know what their inner faith is, but you can look at things like processions, or especially within private spaces, food. Food becomes what you prepare, how you prepare it, when you prepare it, if you fast. All of those are important expressions of religious identity. So there are, especially for, again, the Muslim and Jewish populations in Spain, there are very distinct food practices that would identify one as trying to maintain Jewish or Muslim practices in the household, particularly the avoidance of pork, the proper slaughter of animals, fasting during Ramadan or Yom Kippur, not fasting on Christian holidays. So there are lots of these things that are visible. And this is not to say that they're completely set apart. It's not to say that there aren't lots of culinary traditions, since in both cases, Muslims and Jews have been part of Spanish culture for several centuries. They're fully integrated. And many of the things that they introduce become mainstream Spanish cuisine. Muslims in particular in the medieval period introduce techniques of irrigation that allow for the cultivation of things like citrus fruits, spinach, artichokes, eggplant, pistachios, almonds, rice, lots of really fundamental ingredients that are made possible. This is significant enough to be called by many a Muslim agricultural revolution in Spain. So those things persevere and they're maintained, they're fully adopted into Spanish culture. So it's not necessarily that there are distinct food ways for Muslim and Jewish and Christian populations, but there are more ways of preparing food, especially practices of feasting and fasting that might be different. So here, coming back to a question that was asked after the first presentation, I wanted to come back to the Sanchez-Cotan piece, because it's interesting to think of this in kind of that setting. If you happen to catch Michael Brown's lecture on this still life from several weeks ago, he mentions how Sanchez-Cotan, in this and in several of the other still lifes that he paints, is making interesting choices of the objects that he's representing. In this case, the quince, the cabbage, the melon, the cucumber. In others, carrots, citrus fruits, chayotes. In almost every case, they are either objects from the Americas, like the chayote, or particular food objects that were introduced by the Muslims. Which is curious, because if you remember the food hierarchy that I mentioned in the first presentation, these are not particularly valuable things. If he's choosing, of all the food items in the world, if he's choosing things to represent, these are not things of particular value. But they are things that are associated with Muslim adaptations in the medieval period. In this case, cucumber and melon and quince were all introduced by Muslims. Cabbage is particularly associated with Sephardic cooking. So these might carry that particular association. Michael Brown suggested that. I don't have a definitive answer to offer. These again, in this still life and in the others that he paints, and he has chosen to represent objects that were introduced to Spain, principally through Muslim contributions. I'm not sure if by 1602 people would have thought of them that way. By that point, there's a 600-year heritage of mixing together. So I don't know if people would have seen these and made that association, but it's an interesting possibility that he made those choices. But in any case, when it comes to religious practice, it's not the foods themselves that I don't know if these would have carried a particular religious kind of emphasis, but it's more preparation and timing, particularly preparation that becomes synonymous with religion, which means one can be investigated by the Inquisition for heresy based on how you cook. Again, because this is visible, And it ties into the Catholic emphasis on faith and religion as a question of practice as much as belief, right? So Protestants, and this is the 16th century is the same time frame as the Protestant Reformation, Protestants turn much more towards questions of the inward understanding of faith. But Catholics before, and I think especially after the Reformation, maintain an emphasis on works, on action, on behavior, on what you do as an expression of belief. Communion, mass, procession, things that are visible. So I don't want to get into a whole, well, I do. I want to get into a whole history of the Spanish Inquisition, but I will restrain myself. But it gets, as part of the story, it gets established as a branch of the Spanish state. There is a separate church-wide inquisition to monitor the proper practices of Catholics, but there's a separate Spanish thing that gets established as a political arm of the state in 1489, precisely to deal with the Spanish context of this body of recently converted Jews and Muslims, to supervise them, because the Inquisition only has authority over Catholics. The catch is that in Spain, by the 1500s, you'd have to be Catholic. So regardless of your religious past. And it has, of course, a mostly justifiably terrible reputation. It's a coercive institution. It's trying to impose a certain kind of faith. But it's also, its power has been greatly exaggerated. It's never terribly well funded. It's never very, very powerful, at least at a state level. But it does rely, therefore, very much on communities to police themselves. And I mention that largely because it has this sort of historical reputation of Spanish Inquisition officials are everywhere observing everything. They're really not. There aren't many of them. They're not well paid. They don't do much. But it's not something that is imposed on the Spanish population. It's something the Spanish population embraces. Again, perceiving a defense of religious community, which means people are observing each other. And neighbors pay attention, especially to things like cooking practices, and bring this back around to food. Lots of cases that come to the attention of the Inquisition are people saying, hey, my neighbor doesn't eat pork. My neighbor is preparing these Friday night meals for the Sabbath. My neighbor is doing something suspicious, usually in terms of cooking or fasting. So again, Jewish culinary practices are usually the most visible. The preparation of a garbanzo stew on a Friday night to not have to cook on Saturday, refusing to eat pork, slaughtering animals in a particular way, fasting on certain days. So often, again, these denunciations come from neighbors, they come from servants, in many cases who are intimate members of a household and observing how food practices are maintained. So this has led to really extraordinary documentation of people's households, more than you would have probably gotten otherwise. So for historians, it's kind of a boon, right? We get records of things. I wanted to mention cases like, this is one of my favorite books, A Drizzle of Honey from 1999, but a very well-researched and interesting book. And again, it's largely a recipe collection. So if you're interested in particularly early modern Sephardic cuisine, it's a very usable, sort of adapted to modern measurements and ingredients, but it's a recipe book based on Inquisition trials, because they're Inquisition officials that are paying attention to people's kitchens and responding to denunciations from neighbors. So that, again, it's not the food itself that is that distinctive. It's more fasting on Yom Kippur, or the preparation of, again, Friday night stews for Saturdays. But in any case, the Inquisition is paying attention to these things, and it gives us kind of a window onto people's kitchens. And in fact, gives a list of, there are several documents like this from different regions, but the Inquisition publishes lists of behaviors to watch out for. And most of them, the vast majority of them, have to do with cooking practices. For cooking on Fridays, cleansing meat, cutting away fat or grease, the kinds of foods that are consumed or not consumed, unleavened bread. So there's fairly thorough documentation of these kinds of things. And it's actually also been suggested that over the generations, as these practices are gradually reduced and squashed, these warnings may have actually provided guidelines for families who are looking to know, like, what practices should we be maintaining if you're trying to maintain Jewish practices. But the Inquisition does publish these things as, here's what to look out for. Here are things that are visibly not Christian. So cooking with oil is suspicious. Eating boiled eggs at funerals, fasting on the wrong days. but especially probably the most visible thing that gets people's attention most often is avoiding the consumption of pork, because this is something characteristic of both Muslim and Jewish populations. And again, those of you who have been to Spain, Spaniards love ham. Ham is present everywhere. I think largely for this reason. I think ham really becomes associated with Spanish identity. If you go into any bar, and there are chains, sort of stores, restaurants, a combination of places where you can buy food but also go and have a snack. There are two large ones that are El Museo del Jamón, the Museum of Ham, and Don Jamón, Mr. Ham, that are everywhere. You can't go 2 blocks anywhere in a major city without coming across at least one of these. So ham just has this presence everywhere. It's visible, it's shared all the time. So it's a kind of a fundamental thing for Spanish identity. So if you're refusing ham, if you're visibly not eating ham, that is a dangerous marker, especially in this early modern context of increased emphasis on religious uniformity. So if you combine the importance of pork, the importance of sharing food with people as evidence of loyalty or community or connection or charity, the refusal of food, the refusal of pork in particular, becomes a pretty powerful signal. And this is something even that Miguel de Cervantes, the author of the Quixote, mentions, that if you're traveling for a foreigner traveling in Spain, the best safe conduct is to carry a chunk of ham. Like that, that's your marker that you're an acceptable sort of person. So there are, again, lots of examples of denunciations that come out of things like that. And one case that I came across, Beatriz Alvarez, a woman who lives in a small village near Madrid, this is the early 1620s. There's an Inquisition trial and an investigation of her family that follows simply a visit from there's several neighbors who come over, as they generally do. And one of them offers her family morcilla, which is blood sausage. So doubly prohibited in Jewish tradition, but very tasty if you happen to like it. It was one of the key elements of Spanish cuisine. She's offered a morcilla, and the family accepts politely, but as soon as those neighbors leave, they throw it away, saying that this will defile our house. And another neighbor hears that. And so, okay, and that is sufficient really to complete the investigation. It's not that leads into questions about religion. That alone is enough to identify someone as not being fully Catholic. So there are, again, that's one example of many, but it's the refusal of a food offering, but also that refusal of food that might indicate secretly maintaining Jewish practices. So again, food, these kinds of denunciations aren't necessarily things that lead to a larger investigation. They are sufficient in themselves to indicate guilt. In fact, simply not eating bacon or not cooking with lard, those were sufficient things to induce some kind of penalty. And so I was several years ago reading through lots of these Inquisition trials, which is kind of burdensome in itself. It's a challenging thing. But coming across all of similar stories like this, and thinking really, like Cervantes mentions, you would think people would catch on enough to pretend, to keep some ham in your kitchen, hang a leg in somewhere. And the very next, as I was thinking that, the very next trial that I looked at was the trial of a family whose neighbors had noticed that they had a leg of ham hung in the kitchen and hadn't touched it for several months. So even the presence of ham, they got that part. It's like, oh, well, we'll pretend we'll hang one here. But you have to be seen partaking. You have to be sharing it with people. Otherwise, if not, that could be suspicious. There was another case of a priest, actually, who had come from a converso family, but who had adopted Catholicism enough to enter himself the church to become a priest. And he kept leavened bread on his table, as everyone would, but separately was seen preparing matzo and leavened bread for Passover and was denounced for that. So all kinds of food clues that people are paying attention to. And what you see is, again, it's part of this larger picture of emphasizing religious uniformity, but on using food as a way to measure that proper acceptance and practice. So if food is a key identifier of non-Christians or suspicious Christians, it's also very performative for those who do identify as Catholic. For example, patterns of feasting during Carnival or fasting during Lent. You're probably familiar with the Prodigal painting, the fight between Cardinal and Lent. As all Bruegels, is just wonderfully rich and full of detail. And this is one corner of it, but it's the symbolic battle between Carnival and Lent. And it's all defined by food. right? Carnival is the fat figure on the left in blue. He's riding a beer barrel. He's got a pork chop nailed to the front of the barrel. He's got a spear filled with various kinds of food. He's got a pie on his head. So he is bearing feast. He is himself a feast and bearing all the accoutrements of feasting. So carnival is the excess of food, the indulgence in food. And then he is challenged by Lent, who is carrying sardines or herring. And that's about it. Pretzels, typical Lenten kinds of foods. So there's the excess of carnival, the feasting of the carnival that is then challenged by the fasting of Lent. And again, public displays that tie into the liturgical cycle and indicate proper Catholic practice. So this also means, it indicates this tension between faith and morality and resisting temptation. There's acceptable indulgence in the case of carnival, but then you have to resist that. And Lenten sacrifice involves giving up meat and other treats and fasting. So you see this also, this association with self-control, fasting and morality that are kind of wrapped up together, which is again why gluttony was such a concern in the 16th and 17th centuries. That you see, to bring in more of the Meadows collection, St. Paul the Hermit. This goes back to the early hermetical tradition in Christianity of isolation, of fasting, of going into the desert. All of these things are associated with sort of spiritual purification, the resisting of food, the resisting of the temptations of the flesh of all kinds. And that then is sort of paired up against the images of things like the prodigal son feasting, as Renaissance elites are embracing larger and larger banquets and exotic spices and more sophisticated presentations. That goes along with these concerns about gluttony and immorality and corruption that those things represent. So food is intimately bound up in both of those things, right? The resistance of food is moral and good and virtuous, and the excess of food is corrupt and immoral. So in general, just sort of broadly defining Catholic practice, especially in the early modern period, Christians were meant to abstain from meat. So when I say fasting, I don't mean refusing all food, but simply not eating animal products. Proper practice was to avoid meat on all Fridays of the year, most Saturdays, all of Lent, all of Advent, evenings before major festivals, and others that if you add them all up, it's about 100 days out of a year that one should not eat meat. So a good third of the year is engaged in this avoidance of meat as kind of a spiritual practice. And that too is monitored by the Inquisition, right? The Inquisition was concerned about families who might be secretly maintaining Jewish or Muslim practices, but they're also concerned about the broader Catholic community following proper feasting and fasting practices. So there are denunciations that relate to things like that as well. One of many examples, a case in 1625 that I came across, where there's a group of friends traveling to Madrid, and at least as they explain it, they accidentally kill a piglet that wanders across their path. They're throwing rocks at it, and then they kill it. And they're thinking, well, shouldn't let it go to waste, and we'll take it to a nearby inn and roast it and have a nice little piglet dinner. But that happened to be St. Joseph's Day, which is a holiday that was supposed to involve fasting, and they were seen eating the piglet, and punished by the Inquisition for doing so, for eating meat on a fasting day. So these things matter. This proper food practice is crucial to, and again, it's not a question of, it's partly a question of their salvation, but they're perceived as endangering the broader Christian community by violating these food rules. So they're given penance. Violations of that sort, the Inquisition really does not go out of its way to execute people, but they would assign penance or minor punishments of that sort. But they're keeping an eye on these things. People are watching each other's food practices. So coming back to the idea of fasting and resisting these kinds of temptations, the idea it's meant to represent self-control, to prepare the mind for wisdom and philosophy and moral purity. And you see lots of examples of those kinds of associations. One of the medieval romances about King Arthur tells the tale of one of King Arthur's knights, who at one point on his adventures searching for the Holy Grail, he's offered this extraordinary banquet full of the richest meats and sweets and sauces and wines, and he rejects all of them in favor of bread and water, because he says those are the proper foods of a virtuous knight. So even the medieval knight, the kind of person you would think would be associated with feasting, he rejects that and says, no, my duty is to be obedient and humble and virtuous, and I will only eat, I will only consume bread and water. So there are lots of literary references of those sorts that associate fasting with loyalty, with strength, with devotion, divine grace, also humility and obedience. So these are things, ideally, these are virtues that the whole population should embrace through fasting about a third of the year, but especially for religious communities. So if we look also at the expectations for convents and monasteries, people who have dedicated themselves to a religious life, that carries an even greater burden. It's meant to be a burden. It's meant to be a struggle to resist these temptations. So it's also interesting to look at religious communities and how they take on these kinds of food practices. And it's challenging that there are religious orders that go back to the early centuries of Christianity. Always they include dietary regulations as part of their practice. For example, the original rule of Benedictine monasteries allowed for a maximum of 2 cooked meals per day, principally bread and vegetables, no red meat, minimal amounts of wine. And that's one of my favorite examples because there's always a struggle over these things, especially with wine. So Benedict himself in the original rule for the Benedictines, he says, although we read that wine is not at all proper for monks, yet because monks in our times cannot be persuaded of this, let us agree that we at least drink only sparingly. So even laying out these, he gives up the beginning. We can't prohibit wine, but let's not drink too much. And the initial version of the Benedictine rule allows each monk about 10 ounces a day. So a reasonable drink of wine. But then what's funny to track this is the Benedictine order is established in the 6th century. And it doesn't, those are the first rules that go. Of all the rules about proper monastic behavior, the food ones get bent most quickly. So that, and then there are later orders. For example, the Cistercian order is found in the 11th century, arguing that monks need to get back to those original principles and to go back to poverty, charity, humility, obedience, including the strict dietary rules. And then a few centuries later in Castile, there's another sort of wave of new monastic groups, various orders, Hieronymites, Carthusians, Poor Clares, but all of them share that saying, like we need to go back, we've drifted away, we've gotten soft, we've bent the rules a little bit too much. And we need to go back to the original Benedictine principles, especially related to diet. And what happens in every case, if you trace both the regulations and the account books over time, the food rules are the first to go. Because they're hard to maintain. It's challenging for these communities to maintain the food restrictions. So all of them begin, when the orders are established, they begin with no consumption of animal flesh. That's out, it's prohibited. And then they say, well, chicken sometimes is okay. Poultry is acceptable. Protein is okay, so eggs and cheese are acceptable. And then meat maybe once in a while is okay, especially for monks who are older, people who are sick, they can get permission to have meat. And then, well, if they can, then we could on festival days. We can have meat on festival days, and then also we have visiting guests who should be fed appropriately, so we can have meat for them. And then if there's some left over, it shouldn't be wasted. So just over time, it gets opened up more and more. And by the 1400s, the regulations of the monastery of Santa Ana in Barcelona allowed the monks to slaughter a pig every winter for Christmas. So that just becomes built in to the regular celebrations. By the 1600s, a couple of centuries later, the rules that govern all of the Benedictine monasteries in Spain are relaxed to allow each of the members of their communities a full pound of mutton at their main meal 4 days out of each week. And then the account books of one of them in Madrid shows by the late 1600s, they have regular purchases of rabbit, partridge, kid goat, and daily consumption of bacon. So the prohibition of animal products is long gone by that point. So I think that's a trend that tends to continue, right? Early modern food practices in the Catholic community are very focused on those restrictions. But as for the monasteries, they kind of gradually follow away. Spain is still, of course, by a large majority nominally Catholic, but most of those meat restrictions have really been abandoned. So that there's the ongoing struggle of not quite maintaining those levels of virtue that fasting should represent. Another direction a little bit I wanted to take this is how to adapt these expectations of proper food practice to the larger empire, right? If we're looking at the early modern period, Columbus crossing the Atlantic, you're probably familiar with the idea of the Columbian exchange, where there are plants and animals in the Eastern hemisphere that have become introduced to the Western and vice versa. So things like potatoes and tomatoes and corn that were unfamiliar to Europeans that come from the Americas. And then the other direction, all of the domesticated animals, pigs, sheep, cattle, horses, are from the Eastern hemisphere that are then introduced to the Western. So there's this whole Columbian exchange of new plants and animals. That's really a significant environmental transformation on both sides. But one thing that doesn't often get discussed as part of that is the religious practice of communion that is based on the elements of bread and wine. They don't exist in the Americas. There's no wheat, there are no grapes. So Spanish explorers, as they are making their way through the Americas, at first they simply bring enough supplies because communion is essential. So they bring enough supplies of wheat and wine to maintain themselves while they're deciding what other things could be adapted. How can we adjust to this new environment? And this coincides with the moment when Spanish and Portuguese explorers are not only claiming the Americas, but sailing around Africa and encountering different trade networks in the Indian Ocean, China and Japan. Most of these places don't have wheat and grapes. So it's a particular challenge. And especially given the importance of communion. So I'm drawing on an example. My TCU colleague, Becca Sharpless, has just published a wonderful book called Grain and Fire, A History of Baking in the American South, that I highly recommend. And she takes that American South history back to the earliest Spanish settlement. So she has examples of these early Spanish explorers and the challenges that they face, and particularly in terms of communion. So she mentions an example of a conflict between Spanish and Native American forces in what is today Alabama in 1540. But as part of this conflict, the Spanish supplies are destroyed. They lose their stores of wine and wheat. And so they debate amongst themselves whether it's possible to consecrate corn. Can you make the communion wafer out of something else? Is that possible? And there are significant theological debates about this. But they decide that after this deliberation, that the church in her holy councils and sacred canons orders and teaches us that the bread shall be of wheat and the wine from the grape. So they simply go without communion for actually several years until they straggle into Mexico City by 1543. So these questions of food are essential to questions of salvation. It's a challenging question. And in fact, the Council of Trent in the 1640s determines that the communion wafer must be of wheat. So it's not just what it represents, it has to have a certain nature. So wheat becomes a crucial product that has to be introduced into all of the Spanish Empire. So food is not incidental to religious identity. It's at the very center, it's definitive, especially in this early modern culture that associates identity with visibility, that you publicly perform the kind of person you are, and the connection you have to others. And so, as I mentioned earlier, food is part of that in terms of relationships, in terms of establishing status. We see that it's essential to religious identity as well. And this is what we'll move into next week, food as a way of defining group identity, collectives like students and monasteries, and rituals as well. So the dining habits of the palace, I'll play with them as well. But I will pause with that for today and welcome any questions that you have.
There we go. Thank you so much. As a reminder to those of us in the auditorium, we will need to use the microphone for any questions, so those joining us on Zoom can hear us. So I'm happy to bring a microphone to anyone who has a question.
Even when I was young, I saw pictures in books about art of holding up a flag of some sort of a, don't know. And I was quite astounded that monks would be drunk, which was implied. So I was wondering if there's any kind of a
exactly of that that I replaced with one of the other sort of more collective images. But yes, the monk with the flag, partly because it's an easy thing to mock. But there are lots, like manuscript illustrations from monasteries themselves, because that's one of the ongoing challenges. And it's, yeah, alcohol consumption was higher largely because there simply aren't clean water supplies. So ale and wine were the most common drinks, and they water it down. It's not drinking wine as we would think of it today, but it's an established drink, and not only wine, but just rich foods. There's a common Spanish expression today. If you describe a really wonderful meal, you're eating like a priest, which is eating like a priest, which is the opposite of what you would expect. Priests should be frugal and careful, but they get this reputation of eating very well. So that's, yeah, you see it in art, you see it in literature, just the sort of gentle mocking of the expectation of a certain behavior on one hand, but the reality can be different. In fact, I'll probably have more examples of that next time. I was looking through lots of account books of monasteries, and their collective meals do get sort of gradually richer and richer as time goes on. Especially again with occasions like for guests, or for the abbot always eats a little bit better than the novices.
With the Inquisition, I'm wondering, did anyone successfully defend themselves? Are there any records of that? You know, someone just saying, oh, "I just like matzah," like, you know?
Actually, that doesn't work so well. It's best if you don't try to defend yourself. There are several cases where someone would be perceived to not be eating pork when they should have been, and they'll just say, "I just don't like it." That's not really an option. You can't just not like it. People will argue this, like, I don't feel well, I don't want to eat something, and that's still suspicious. The best way to get around the Inquisition is to say, yes, you're right, I'm sorry. Because what the goal of the church is reconciliation. They want to bring you back into the Christian community, and if you admit you were wrong, that works. Which is again is weirdly coercive, but successfully so. But that's, you would get a very mild penance, if anything, by accepting whatever they say, admitting it, and promising not to do it again. The people that get harsher punishments are the people that do resist and say, "No, I didn't do that," or "I meant to do it." And especially that the numbers of people that were executed are exaggerated. They do execute people, but only if those people have resisted and persist in what they're doing several times. So really the most effective way, if you wanted to defend yourself, you would simply say, "You're right, I was wrong. I was eating matzah. I was my grandmother taught me how to do this. I won't do it again." And then you keep doing it secretly. But the public apology is kind of the crucial thing to survive.
Okay, we just have a question that came in on Zoom. So it reads, were there any monastic orders founded in Spain that had distinct food or fasting practices from similar orders outside of Spain?
Probably, yes. I don't know the distinctions terribly well, but they tend to be international. The Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, they're not limited to any particular country. So they would establish their own rule, and there were some regional variations, but in theory, the rules were were applied to the whole community, and they're all very similar. They all follow similar kinds of again, usually at the beginning when they're founded, they have stricter kinds of rules, and then they all relax a little bit as they go. But they tend to be similar to each other and across Western Europe.
Could you speak to the Alta da Fe painting? It looked very complicated and layered. Thank you.
If I recall, yes. So it's a 1495 representation of the earlier establishment of the Inquisition. So it's, yeah, it has all these different elements of the, let's see if I can, yeah, I'll show here. The those who are to be burned at the stake are here. This is the founder, the historical founder of the Inquisition is represented here, Saint Dominic, Santo Domingo. And then it's an interesting representation because you've got a guy falling asleep here. The Inquisition officials themselves are kind of indifferent. And then the people that are being escorted, these are the people that would be labeled with the San Benito. There would be sort of a cloth that you would wear to identify the crime that had been committed and then the punishment for it. That was a common sort of punishment, was wearing an identification, sort of the scarlet letter, but in a medieval sort of context, that you would wear for a period of weeks or months to identify you. Again, it's a visible thing for the community to label you. And in some cases, for more serious transgressions, once you were finished, you would wear it for a period of weeks, and then it would be hung in your community, in your parish church, for some time afterwards. So those kinds of punishments were more frequent, things that were not physical punishments or even financial punishments, but visible things that were shaming. To identify you as a problematic member of the community. So those are the kinds of things that are reflected here with the hats and the San Benito. But you've got sort of all the different stages of an auto de fe that are represented at once.
Okay, well, I would like to echo some of the comments coming in through Zoom, just to thank you again for another fantastic presentation. We look forward to seeing everyone for the final lecture next Friday. Thank you
all
so
for
much.
coming. I appreciate it.